a frantic expression of grief.
They don't know who Isa was.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد. وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين، سيما بقية الله في الأرضين وحجته على الخلائق أجمعين، سيدنا وإمام زماننا وصاحب نعمتنا وولي أمرنا مهدي هذه الأمة الحجة بن الحسن العسكري فداه أرواح العالمين. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هذه سبيلي أدعو إلى الله على بصيرة أنا ومن اتبعني. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Brothers and sisters, scholars, clerics, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We find ourselves in increasingly challenging times, trying times, testing environments. We find ourselves specifically at this juncture in time in a place where we almost need to justify our existence. We need to explain to ourselves before others why we have the right to exist alongside people of other faiths, other ethnicities, and so on. And although it should never come to the stage where we need to justify why we exist, it is good, on the other hand, for us to reevaluate our position in society, for us to re-examine what we stand for and who we are. Hence the discussion of our identity as individuals, our individual identity, as well as our social identity, and of course within the larger context of our global identity. It is good for us to re-examine this question because it allows us to dive in at the deep end of what makes us unique, and once again, what it is that we stand for as Muslims, first and foremost, because that is ultimately what brings us all together. Our ethnicities may differ, our nationalities may differ, many of our values may differ, but ultimately we all identify ourselves as Muslims. Specifically, if you want to get more specific, then you say we are followers of the Ahlul Bayt, meaning that not only are we Muslims, but we also distinguish ourselves from other Muslims in that we follow a very specific stream of Islam, that which subscribes to the Ahlul Bayt. And in doing so, what we're doing is that we're creating an identity for ourselves that is unique. And to put it in another way, to identify ourselves, to define ourselves, to give ourselves recognizable traits, is to both show the similarities between ourselves as well as the differences between us and the larger global community. And so that's exactly what identity is. It allows you to highlight both the similarities and the differences. For two things to be identical, they would need to share all of their characteristics. They would have to be, and there's a philosophical argument about this, for two things to be absolutely identical, do they have to be the one and the same, or can they be different? But far from these philosophical debates, what we're talking about here is, first of all, what are the similarities between us as Shia Muslims, and what are the differences between us as Shia Muslims with the wider world? And if you think about it, an identity is really an image that we create with which we compare ourselves. And so, within the sphere of identity, there needs to be an image created. so that I could compare myself to that image and therefore identify with it. Even your individual, your personal identity, and without getting too philosophical about this, even that you need to create an image for yourself. You need to create a mental image that you can compare yourself to. So that image needs to be there for you to have an identity to begin with. And that image is composed of your values, your principles, your beliefs, what you think should be the ideal identity, what you think should be the real you, even if at times we find ourselves having shortcomings, having challenges, having issues, identifying with that image. But ultimately, you create an image that is ideal, that is almost perfect, and you try to compare yourself to that image. Which brings me to my next point. And that is that if identity relies on that ideal image, on that perfect image, on that ideal, therefore, there must always be an image for identity to exist. I think, therefore I exist kind of thing. If that image is not there, or if there is an image which is less than ideal, then it will have to be replaced with one that is corrupt. That's why you find people all over the world trying to identify with others, trying to identify with what they perceive as being that ideal image. And so, if there is a religion that they can identify with, that they believe is ideal, is perfect, is something that allows them to progress and develop spiritually and mentally and physically and so on, then they identify themselves with that religion. If not, they'll find celebrities, they'll find pop stars, they'll find sports individuals, they'll find people like Oprah Winfrey. The other day I was reading an article about how a group of women have come together creating a religion, an organized religion that idolizes Oprah Winfrey. They call it Oprahology. And we may laugh at this, but the reality is, because there is that vacuum, because there is a sense of emptiness where that ideal image should have been, therefore they look to such celebrities like Oprah Winfrey and say, well, here's a woman that I can relate to. Here's a person who had very humble beginnings. Here's a person who was poor. Here's a person who was abused as a child. Here's a person who had nothing to start with, who was able to stand on her feet, who was able to emerge from beneath the rubble, who was able to create a business for herself, who was able to learn, and who was able to acquire knowledge and ultimately start a show that spanned for 25 years and make billions of dollars, in addition to all the fans, all the friends, and all the admirers all over the world. So that is who I want to be. That is, to them, to these individuals, the Oprahologists, if you like, that is the image that replaces that ideal image. Which is why it's so important for us to try and identify ourselves with people who are really ideal and who are really perfect, like the Ahlul Bayt from a young age, so that we're not deceived by these pseudo-idealistic personalities. So that we don't follow individuals who are very much imperfect, who are just like everybody else, who happen to work hard at the end of the day. وَلَا تَبْخَسُ النَّاسَ أَشْيَاءَهُمْ. We're not trying to say that their success was a fluke of nature. We're not saying that they just happened to be lucky. No, they worked hard. They tried their best to try and amass that wealth. But here's the problem. The problem is we mix, we get our system of values and vices mixed up. Suddenly wealth becomes a value. And so every wealthy person is the subject of admiration by millions around the world or billions around the world. Because to us, that perfect mental image is an individual who's got many, many zeros in their balance sheet, who have many zeros and many digits in their bank account, who have a big house, who have that white, beautiful picket fence, and will have the cars, and who can enjoy the luxuries. That becomes an ideal, and therefore, that mental image with which we create our identities becomes corrupt. And if you think about it, Europe, especially because in the 17th, 18th, and particularly in the 19th century, when it was going through the Renaissance, it was going through a reformation of their ideals, and they came up with new systems to replace the archaic medieval systems that governed society. They had to struggle with many of these questions themselves. And what they created was, again, a very imperfect ideal image. What they created was liberal democracy. They created the capitalist system, which emphasizes an individual's personal space and individual's liberties, but also the fact that a true individual worth is that individual's ability to output economically. And so you're only as good as how much you can produce. You're only as good as how much money you make. And that's one of the reasons why women were so degraded in, even 19th century Europe. Women were seen as these people who produced less than what they consumed. Because they were weaker and they weren't given equal chances as men, they weren't able to produce as much economically. And that, because once again, this is what establishes a person's individual worth. Therefore, women were worth less than men. In the 19th century, England, for instance, creates this tribunal to try and reassess the system of slavery. And we all know how slavery was used as a pretext to kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in the United States and Africa, all over the world. I was reading a book recently about the history of the United States called The People's History of the United States. A very interesting read, I might add, where the author begins the book by talking about the atrocities that were committed by Christopher Columbus and the subsequent people that were sent and dispatched by the Spanish monarchs to the United States trying to look for gold, there were two industries they were really focused on. There was gold that they assumed that there was massive stashes of gold in this new world, and also because they simply wanted to go and collect these slaves, the Indians, and take them back to contribute to the slave trade. The atrocities that were committed were absolutely unspeakable. Hundreds of thousands of people, complete nations being wiped out so that a bunch of wealthy, rich European monarchs could accumulate even more money. But what's interesting is that they had this tribunal in the United Kingdom to reassess the system of slavery, and not a single woman was appointed in that tribunal. So women's opinion was completely irrelevant when it came to slavery. And this is 19th century. This is, 14 centuries, I should say, or 13 centuries after the revolution of Ashura was led by a woman, Zainab. If you look at the way Islam treats its women, and this isn't my topic, but if you look at how Islam grooms women to become leaders, and compare that to what we have even in today's modern society. I mean, wasn't it that, if you remember, a couple of years ago, there was that female politician in Belgium who announced that if she gets 40,000 people, and I'm sorry to have to say this, but she said that if 40,000 people vote for her, if they register on her party's website expressing interest to vote for her, then she will strip naked for them on the website so they can take a look at her. Or that Italian politician who nominated herself on behalf of her party, who said that I will go on a parade from point A to point B, from this street to that street, and as I go along, I invite people to come because I will be stripping, taking off one piece of my clothing at a time, all the way until I get to to the point where we end the procession. And that was her way of kind of getting people to vote for her. I'm not saying that this is representative of how Western society looks at women, but ultimately the reason this exists and the reason that such women thrive and even end up getting the votes is because there is a craving for this kind of mentality, for this kind of lifestyle. This modern day form of slavery where women's worth is attributed to how much they can please men, is attributed to how much they can produce economically in economic terms. Whereas you look at Islam and you see examples such as in the life of Zainab once again, where the commander of the faithful, Amir al-Mu'mineen, her father, he taught the entire family, including his two noble, immaculate, sinless sons, Imam al-Hassan and Imam al-Hussein, that if Zainab ever walks in the room, you stand up for her. This is the same school of thought where Amir al-Mu'mineen says to Zainab, but she's 5 years old if I'm not mistaken, 4 or 5 years old. He says to her, say wahid, one. She says wahid. He says to her, say ithnan, two. She says, but with the same tongue that I said wahid, how could I say ithnan? By saying one, I referred to the one. I referred to God. And I can't use the same tongue to say two because there's only one God. I mean, and we're not talking about an infallible individual here. Zainab was certainly infallible from a practical perspective. But this is an example for us to imitate. And it's this individual that then leads a revolution that topples the oppressive, tyrannical, despotic government of the Umayyads ultimately. Look at the example of Fatima al-Zahra. I swear, I was saying to a group of brothers and sisters the other day, I said, sometimes you have these interesting proverbs, these statements that are on bumper stickers. This is what needs to go on bumper stickers. And you know what? It's disrespectful of us to put these statements on bumper stickers. They need to be written with gold. And they need to be used as mantras and slogans for civilizations to emerge. Where Fatima al-Zahra, for instance, on her wedding night, offers her wedding gown to a poor woman who comes to her asking for articles of clothing. Now, she could have given her second-hand clothes, but she doesn't. Remember, this is the same woman who used to say, Al-Jar, Thumma Ad-Dar. She'd spend all night praying to God from dusk till dawn. And in the end, after praying so much, after beseeching God for His mercy, she begins to pray for her neighbors. Imam al-Hassan says, Ummah, halla da'awti lana. Would you not pray for us? Which shows the relationship between the Ahlul Bayt, the members of the infallible household, with their mother Fatima al-Zahra, where they would need her intercession and her prayers. And then Fatima al-Zahra would say, Al-Jar bunay, Al-Jar thumma ad-dar. Neighbors come before my own home. Now put that on a bumper sticker, where neighbors become more relevant and become more important than our own household. Fatima al-Zahra hands over the wedding gown to that woman on the most special night of the most special lady. She gives away the most special thing about that night. The Prophet then comes home. He says, Ya Fatima, why are you wearing this old dress of yours? Probably patched up. She said, because someone came who needed it more than I did. So I gave it to her. The hadith says, فَبَكَى رَسُولُ اللَّهِ. The Prophet cried. And it's at that moment that he uttered a statement that reverberates throughout history, that shows not only the Prophet's love and admiration for his daughter, but the special position of women in Islam, where the Prophet says, فَعَلَتْ. She did it. فِدَاهَا أَبُوهَا. May her father be sacrificed for her. The messenger of God, the greatest apostle, says, I would be ransomed for my daughter, having done such a thing. This is the position of women in Islam. Compare that. So I think what's important for us, brothers and sisters, when talking about individual identity, when talking about social identity, and more importantly, when talking about global identity of Muslims, is for us to create a mental image that is perfect. Let's not compromise on the image. If we're going to compromise, and we all know nobody's perfect, we're going to compromise in imitating that image. It's sad, but it happens. But let's not compromise with the image itself. And one thing to look at when developing that identity, one thing that I recommended a few months ago when I was in London, I said, as followers of the Ahlul Bayt, as Shia of the Ahlul Bayt, we need strategic initiatives. We need to develop our tools. We have the best product. Our problem is that we're so underinvested when it comes to promoting the product. We are very, very bad, and let's face it, brothers and sisters, aside from a few isolated attempts here or there, where you have some dedicated groups and dedicated individuals trying to promote the cause in a modern way, in a way that makes it relevant to people's lives in the 21st century. Aside from that, we're really, really bad when it comes to PR. And I offered a suggestion. I said, why don't we have, just like Jews have Holocaust memorial museums, for instance. In Canada, I'm aware of a museum called the Human Rights Museum. If there's a museum for human rights, why can't we, as followers of Imam Hussein, have a Ashura museum? Why not select a place in the heart of Toronto, or in the heart of New York, or the heart of Washington, D.C., or London, and dedicate that to Imam Hussein, where people could walk in and get a glimpse, get snapshots of who Imam Hussein was, what he did, the sacrifices that were made on the day of Ashura, with sculptures of the 72 companions, with models of the weapons that were used, with perhaps a large, almost lifelike landscape that depicts that of Karbala. Why not? Why is it that people are promoting what little that they have? And we have such great gems, brothers and sisters. We all know this. Unfortunately, we've compartmentalized. We've confined what we have, the treasures of the Ahlul Bayt, within our own very small inner circles, within the mosques and the Imam Bargas that we attend on a regular basis, but that's about it. I'm aware of one group, for instance, in Dearborn, which started with some sort of a contest to get people motivated to draw paintings that depict Imam al-Hussein and the relationship between Imam al-Hussein and Jesus, that of Imam Hussein and Moses. And you'd be surprised how many similarities there are, even in Christian and Jewish heritage, between the Ahlul Bayt and those prophets. And it's very humble. It really is. You walk in, it's a small hall, there's very little lighting. It's not really done in a very professional way because they lack funding. But they get delegations sent all the way from Australia to come and see this museum. If we develop this idea further, and put our minds together, put our heads together, get some serious funding in place, we could create a Ashura or Imam Hussein museum that will act as a beacon to transmit the message of the Ahlul Bayt and Imam Hussein to school children, to college students, to researchers, to tourists, to people who want to learn more about this person who is buried in Karbala and has 250 million visitors on an annual basis. It's intriguing, it's interesting. Unfortunately, we're very bad at PR, as I said. And to identify ourselves with these noble characters, as I said, starting with the Prophet, starting with the most noble messenger of God, starting with a man who came down, he climbed down from the mount in which he used to go, his sanctuary, if you like, where he used to go and worship his Lord. And from the moment he descended from that mountain, to the moment he descended from the pulpit after bidding his nation farewell, we're talking about a period of 23 years. Within 23 years, brothers and sisters, he was able to amass so much admiration, so much love, that Abu Sufyan, he went out as the Prophet and his armies were approaching Mecca. He went out there observing the army as they got closer and closer. Then he ran back to Mecca. He told his friends and fellow comrades, he said to them, we can never fight this man. We can't. They said, why? He said, because I was observing for a while. He shaved his head, and not a single hair fell to the ground. It was all collected by his followers for barakah, for blessing. He would wash his face while performing wudu, and not a single drop of that water would fall to the ground, because his followers would be collecting every single one of them for blessing. This kind of admiration, this kind of love and dedication, there's no way we can fight them. What did he do? And I think it's important for us every once in a while to re-examine the life of the Prophet. The Ahlul Bayt in general, but specifically the Prophet, because of all the challenges that stood in his way, and yet he was able to persevere. He was able to become, right now, the single most popular name in the world is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There are more people, and it's interesting because I always thought that Christians would name their kids Jesus, but for some reason they don't. I really don't know why. Maybe there is the divine element that prevents them from trying to kind of to use that name. Maybe they know that as imperfect human beings, we shouldn't kind of, I don't know what the issue is. I know in South America it's a little more common than the rest of the world. But the fact that people want to name their children, I mean, what's your most valuable possession? What's the most valuable thing in your life? What do you love the most? It's your kids. And for you to name your kids after this noble prophet says a lot about our love and devotion to him. What was it that made people like Sa'd ibn Rabi'a, who was dying in the battle of Uhud? Ubay ibn Ka'b says, I went up to Sa'd ibn Rabi'a and I said to him, do you have any last wishes, my brother? Is there anything that I could do for you? He said, yes. You see this man, this prophet? I want you to make sure that not a single hair of his sees any kind of damage. There's no harm that reaches him whatsoever for as long as you're alive. That's my last wish at the time of my death. What did the prophet do to create so much love and so much admiration, as I said? What did he do to the point where you have individuals like Mus'ab ibn Umayr? Mus'ab ibn Umayr came from a very wealthy family. His mother told him that if you embrace this new religion, if you leave our way of life, the idolatry that we're accustomed to, then I will have to disown you. I will kick you out of the house and I will give you nothing to survive on. You're on your own. He said to her, mother, you can take everything I have, including my life, and I won't abandon this prophet. And when he died, Mus'ab ibn Umayr, when he fell in the battle of Uhud, the Prophet came up to him and recited the verse, مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ رِجَالٌ صَدَقُوا مَا عَاهَدُوا اللَّهَ عَلَيْهِ فَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ قَضَى نَحْبَهُ وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَنْتَظِرُ وَمَا بَدَّلُوا تَبْدِيلًا. There are men among the believers who have been true to their commitments that they've made towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he's one of them. Another man by the name of Abd al-Uzza, the Prophet had a habit where if a person came to him with a name that had vile connotations, evil connotations, the Prophet would ask him to change his name. So it's not necessary for every convert to change their name, but there were names which were truly horrible. Names like Harb, war. Imagine somebody called war. The Prophet would change their name. Or in this case, his name was Abd al-Uzza, the worshipper, the slave of Uzza, one of the idols. The Prophet changed his name to Abdullah. خَيْرُ الْأَسْمَاءِ مَا حُمِّدَ وَعُبِّدَ. The best of names are the ones that derive from Muhammad, or is a derivative of Muhammad or Abdullah. So he also had a very rich father, and his father died. His uncle became his guardian and became custodian of the father's estate. His uncle told him that if you think about leaving our way of life and become a Muslim, you will not get a single dime from your father's estate. His inheritance will not reach you at all. He said, do what you will. Abdullah was just a few months later seen by the Prophet in the mosque of Rasulullah, where the Prophet walked in, he looked at him, then the Prophet began to cry because he had nothing on him except for 2 small pieces of cloth to cover his body. The Prophet cried for him, and he was later known as Abdullah Dhul Wujadain, Abdullah, the one with the 2 pieces of cloth. And when he died, when they came back from Tabuk, and he had been martyred along with the other Muslims, the Prophet came to him, he wiped the dust off of his face, and he said to him, Allahumma inni radin anhu. Oh Lord, I am pleased with Abdullah. Farda anhu. So you be pleased with him also. What did the Prophet do to create so much love that a person would abandon everything? His wealth, his family, his fame, everything they've got. When we know Allah says in the Quran, وَلَوْ أَنْفَقْتَ مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ, O Prophet, if you spend everything that is under the sun, you won't be able to acquire this much love. Money can buy you some friends. Not real friends, but companions. If you invite people over a party, you'll have a lot of people showing up because there's free food and there's drinks. But if you invited people to war, let's see how many friends you got there. If you invite people to famine, to poverty, to a life of destitution, to having been confined to Sha'b Abi Talib, where people would literally have nothing to eat, where you'd have 10 individuals with only 1 date. They'd take that date, they couldn't chew on it, they couldn't bite it because it was so small, and there's 10 of them. They would literally lick the date and hand it over to the second person. When a person like Mus'ab ibn Umayr or Abdullah Dhul Wujadain abandon everything they've got, it means that what they've done is that they've created a mental image for themselves, which is that of the Prophet of Islam. And they're not satisfied until they strive hard enough to reach that mental image. The Prophet was able to change a degenerate society, which would fight each other over a camel, shedding each other's blood for years to come. Think about it. They'd start a fight over a camel or a goat, and they'd continue to fight for generations, so that the second and third generation forgot all they forgot the reason why they started the fight in the first place. The Prophet was able to take these individuals, this very degenerate society, and convert it into one where you would have the people of Medina sharing their every possession with the Muhajirin. Everything they had. A complete 50-50 split. The same people who killed each other over a goat. He was able to transform a vile community which spat out the most vulgar profanities. Even by today's standards, those profanities were filthy. If you look at some of the historical narratives of what people were like, they were absolutely filthy. Suddenly they're changed into a community that greets each other by saying, Assalamu alaikum. Salam, meaning peace. Imagine, the most beautiful greeting of all. I'm not sure what hello means, and I'm not sure why we use it as well. But honestly, what's more beautiful than peace be upon you? Peace. The very word makes you feel peaceful, makes you feel at peace. It's that same society. The Prophet was able to do that, where within a span of 23 years, he's thrown out of Mecca and he's upset. He's sad. He's been thrown out of his birthplace. And then he comes back a mere decade later, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the atmosphere in the most beautiful way, and He says, إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ وَرَأَيْتَ النَّاسَ يَدْخُلُونَ دِينَ اللَّهِ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ أَفْوَاجًا. People are entering this religion not as individuals, but you see multitudes of individuals entering the faith. So what did the Prophet do? I think this is important for us to conclude, to try and highlight some of the attributes, some of the characteristics, some of the secrets of the Prophet's success, so that we could imitate those, so that we could create a better mental image of our identity. Number one, Allah says, قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ أَنَا وَمَنِ اتَّبَعَنِي. Basira, say to them that this is my path. I call unto God with knowledge, with gnosis. Basira means to have clarity of vision. It means to know what you're talking about. It means to use logic. One of the most powerful things about Islam is that it's consistent with logic. And we say this all the time. But the fact of the matter is, even though there are things that might like to die, the angel of death says to him, Ya Rasulullah, believe it or not, I'm actually treating you, I'm giving you special treatment. This is not how other people die. They really suffer. Those sins have to be washed somehow. And so the Prophet then said to him, Shaddid alayhi wa khaffif ala ummati. Go harder on me and easier on my people. I want to make that sacrifice. Ummati! Salama says that I would see him coming back with blood all over him, covering him from head to toe, having been the target of those stones being thrown at him and those pebbles. He comes back home wounded all over, and I see him murmuring to himself, Ilahi, اغفر لقومي فإنهم لا يعلمون. Oh God, forgive my people, for they do not know. In other words, not only have I forgiven them myself, O Lord, but I want you to forgive them as well. And then he makes up an excuse for them. It's unbelievable, I swear to God. I've forgiven them, number one. Oh Lord, I want you to forgive them as well, number two. Number three, he makes up an excuse and he says, they don't know. They don't know, they don't get it. Dedication. Persistence was also a hallmark of the Prophet's message. I'll have to move on. We've run out of time. Where the Prophet is persistent. A person came from the tribe of Bani Adam. He said to him, Ya Rasulullah, I love your religion. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's got everything that you look for in a religion. The only thing is, I wish to embrace it. And if I do, being the chief of my tribe, I'll have hundreds of other people also embracing your faith. You'll have hundreds more warriors to defend you. And this is at a critical juncture in the Prophet's history where he needed help, he needed the support. He said, I'll become a Muslim and so will my entire tribe. I have one condition. The Prophet said, what's that? He said that you appoint me as your successor after your death. So I don't want anything to do with this religion right now. You get to lead your people, you get to do whatever you want. But after you die, I want to be a part of this. Now he was a successful, a smart entrepreneur. He looked at a business model that looked very successful, and he wanted to buy a stake into it. He wanted to basically invest for the future. I want to be your heir and your successor. The Prophet said, no. No. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to give you a promise that I'll end up breaking, because it's not up to me to say who's my successor. I'm not the one who chooses my successor. The one who appointed me as the Prophet will also appoint my successor for me. Absolute persistence. Another group came up to him and said, Ya Rasulullah, this is from the tribe of Bani Faqif. They said to him, Ya Rasulullah, we love your religion, everything about it is wonderful. The only thing is prayers. It's like some people say, beautiful religion. Hijab I can't do. Beautiful religion. Hajj, I'm not sure. Beautiful religion. Alcohol, I'm an alcohol, I'm addicted. Beautiful religion, I need to gamble. Beautiful religion. And it's like religion a la carte. It's like religion where they pick and choose what they want to have. The Prophet said to them, that's not good enough. La khayra fi deenin la salata fi. There's no good in any religion where there's no prayer in it. You might as well drop the whole thing. Persistence. So, in the application of these religious laws, there is leniency. There is flexibility, of course. The Prophet once walked into the mosque, and I realize I've taken more than my share of time, but let me just conclude with this. The Prophet walks into the mosque, and he notices one of the companions who had tied himself to a rope, and he was leaning on that rope to pray. So, he couldn't stand upright, but he was kind of leaning on the rope to help him stand. The Prophet came and he said, what is this? إِنِّي بُعِثْتُ بِالشَّرِيعَةِ السَّمْحَةِ السَّهْلَةِ or السَّهْلَةِ السَّمْحَةِ. I was sent with a revelation that is flexible, that is forgiving, that is easy. In other words, if you're sick and you can't stand upright, you don't have to. You don't have to kill yourself to pray. When it comes to prayer itself, in the essence of prayer, there's no compromise. In the essence of all the other acts of worship, there's no compromise. In the essence of hijab, there's no compromise. But if you're forced into a position where it's death, or it's extreme difficulty, or having to take it off, then إِنِّي بُعِثْتُ بِالشَّرِيعَةِ السَّهْلَةِ السَّمْحَةِ. So the essence remains intact, but the application is always very much flexible. Finally, his morality, his akhlaq, where the great Lord of the universe, Al-Azim, God is the true Alim. He says, إِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. If I said to somebody, you're smart, there's no reason to be proud of that, because who am I to tell you that you're smart? But if Albert Einstein said that so-and-so is smart, then that person must really be smart. If I had said to the Prophet that you have great morals, that would be completely irrelevant. But when God, the Almighty, great Lord of the universe, says you have great morals, then we have a hint as to how great his morality was. Just one example, a person walks into the mosque, he notices the Prophet wearing a robe. So he goes up to him, he grabs the robe, and he pulls it so hard that it leaves a mark across the Prophet's neck. And not only did he do that, but then he said, Ya Muhammad. He addressed him with his first name, which we're not supposed to do. أَعْطَنِي مِنْ مَالِ اللَّهِ. Give me from God's money. It's not your money, it's God's. Give it to me. The companions all got up, they unsheathed their swords, they were about to massacre the poor dude. The Prophet said, no, leave him alone. Leave him alone, he's right. This is God's money. Ya Ali, اقطع لسانه. Oh Imam Ali, go make him quiet. Give him something. So Amir al-Mu'mineen went and gave him a little bit of money. And the man just walked off, not even thanking the Prophet. The fact that the Prophet had to observe patience with the idolaters, the non-believers, the so-called hypocritical Muslims, some of his wives as well. The fact that his patience was so great that on one occasion, one of his wives, she wakes up, she was very jealous. She wakes up in the middle of the night. The Prophet's not sleeping in his bed. She immediately thinks of the worst case scenario. He must have gone to one of his other wives. So she gets up, and as she's walking out the door, she steps on the Prophet's neck as he was prostrating. The Prophet gets up, and remember, this is the most patient person the earth has ever known. And yet, it was so painful that the Prophet got up and he said, لَقَدْ آذَيْتِينِي يَا عَائِشَةَ. You've hurt me. What are you doing? The patience that he observed with his family, his friends, his companions, and everyone else. Let me conclude with just one point. Our duty towards this individual, and the way we repay him, and the way we uphold his image, and his character, and his example in our lives is by doing the following. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقدموا بين يدي الله ورسوله. Do not try to walk ahead of the Prophet. Do not try to be more dedicated or more religious or more pious than the Prophet. Do not try to get closer to God than the Prophet. Follow his example and you shall succeed. Take his example as the image with which you identify and you will succeed. We will become the leaders of mankind once we re-identify ourselves with the example of the Ahlul Bayt. We take them as our role models and present them to the world and try and imitate them in our lives in every single way possible. And that can't be created unless we read about them, we learn of them, we remember and memorize their words. There were people back in the Prophet's time who would try and ask anything. They would go to the Prophet and say, Ya Rasulullah, I have waswas, I have doubt. How can you help me? I oversleep. We have traditions where people would go to the Imams and say, we oversleep. Is there a remedy for this? Can we do something about it? They would go to the Imams and say, I have this pain and I have this issue, this spiritual problem. And the Imams would help. Unfortunately, the reason we've lost that position of prominence, that position of leadership, is because we have not taken the Ahlul Bayt as our role models. We have not asked them the right questions, and we haven't tried to dig up the answers from within the wealth of knowledge that they have left for us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us all and to help us in our pursuit of perfection that is in line with the image of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. هذا والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.